We are AI hosts, and we're here to break down complex topics. Today, we're taking a deep dive into Scenario DNA's report on measuring cultural resonance.
This report really pushes us to rethink how we measure success, to go beyond just looking at the numbers,
So beyond those traditional metrics.
and really understand how people connect with products, services, and the systems around them.
So what are we talking about when we say traditional metrics?
Things like KPIs, segmentation, usability studies,
But those aren't enough anymore.
they're still important. But the report argues that they don't tell the whole story. They often miss those broader cultural and systemic dynamics that are at play.
So let's unpack that. The report breaks down cultural resonance into three dimensions.
Emotional, cultural, and systemic.
All right, let's start with emotional resonance.
That's all about understanding those subconscious desires.
People's aspirations.
Right. Figuring out how a product or service makes someone feel.
Okay, so how do you get to that?
It uses things like need state analysis and human-centered design to try and unearth what individuals truly want. Can you give an example?
Think about Apple products. They're not just functional. They're often associated with creativity and innovation.
So people want to feel like they're part of that.
Exactly. It evokes this sense of aspiration and belonging in users.
So it's not just about what the product does, but about the feeling it gives you.
Right, and that emotional connection can be really powerful.
Okay. So how is cultural resonance different?
Cultural resonance looks at how offerings align with values and trends within different subcultures and across society.
So it's about understanding the broader cultural context.
Absolutely.
And what kind of tools do we use to figure that out?
Tools like market segmentation and archetypal analysis play a key role here.
Can you walk us through how that works?
Let's say a brand is targeting a younger demographic. They need to know what that demographic cares about. Like what? Sustainability, social consciousness, things like that.
Those are big for younger generations.
And then the brand needs to reflect those values in their messaging and even their brand identity. Makes sense. Now, the third dimension, systemic resonance. It seems to be about how innovations fit into the bigger picture.
Exactly. Systemic resonance looks at the contributions a product or service makes to sustainability, equity, and the interconnectedness of everything.
So it's about the impact beyond just the individual consumer.
Right. This is where tools like pestle analysis and scenario planning metrics come into play.
To assess that broader impact.
Think about a company like Patagonia. They're known for their commitment to environmental conservation.
I've heard they even donate a percentage of their sales to environmental causes.
That's a great example of how a company's focus on systemic resonance resonates with consumers who share those values.
So their actions align with their message.
And that can build a lot of trust and loyalty.
The report argues that relying solely on traditional metrics can actually be a problem.
It can be.
Why is that?
Traditional metrics are important, but they tend to focus mainly on quantitative outcomes.
So they're all about the numbers.
Exactly, and they can overlook those qualitative factors that are so crucial for cultural resonance. Emotional connection, cultural relevance, ethical considerations.
Those things can be hard to measure, right?
They can be, but they're becoming increasingly important in today's world. We need to understand things like cognitive load, cultural trends, and even latent desires.
Latent desires.
Those are the desires people may not even be aware of themselves.
And how do we tap into that?
By understanding the interplay of emotional, cultural, and systemic forces that shape behavior, it's complex, but it's also where the real opportunity lies.
I see. So the report introduces this concept of culture mapping
Yes.
as a method to navigate all of this. Can you tell us more about that?
So culture mapping is about getting to those really subtle cultural nuances that are driving people's needs,
So it's about going deeper.
and then connecting those user insights back to broader societal trends.
How does that work in practice?
Culture mapping has two layers. The first layer focuses on identifying, signifying words that hold cultural or emotional weight.
So words that really resonate with people.
Those words are scored and plotted to see how much impact they have.
So what's an example of that?
The report mentions this global audio brand. They were using the word intent a lot in their messaging,
In relation to?
art production, and they found that it was actually counterproductive
Why?
because it implied this fixed meaning,
Ah,
which didn't sit well with the audience's belief that art should be open to interpretation.
interesting. So what do?
They switched to using the word curiosity instead.
And that resonated better.
Much better. It suggests a more open-minded approach to experiencing art.
So even just changing one word can make a big difference.
It can.
Okay. What about layer 2?
Layer 2 brings in a quantitative dimension. So we take the frequency of those signifying words and score them within a matrix framework.
And what does that tell us?
That allows us to cluster those words into archetypal themes. So we can see what mindsets are dominant within a particular culture and which ones are emerging.
The report has an example of this, right?
Yes, they worked with a client whose segmentation was really skewed towards what they call residual codes.
What does that mean?
It means that the client was focused on outdated mindsets,
And missing out on.
key perspectives that could have fueled innovation. Culture mapping helped them see that blind spot.
So they could adjust their strategy.
Exactly. That's just one example of how powerful this tool can be.
It sounds like it. Now, the report also talks about how AI is changing how we measure cultural resonance.
That's a really exciting development.
I'm curious to hear more about that.
It's interesting to think about how all of this connects back to the idea of measurement.
Because we ultimately need a way to figure out if we're actually achieving cultural resonance.
Exactly. And the report challenges us to think beyond those traditional metrics we talked about earlier.
To look at things differently.
It really emphasizes embracing those unknowns
Unknown.
and ambiguity as critical measures that are constantly evolving.
Okay, that sounds a bit paradoxical. How can you measure something that's inherently unknown, or ambiguous for that matter?
It's about shifting our mindset, moving away from seeking definitive answers.
So not looking for that one right answer.
Right. And instead, fostering this ongoing process of inquiry.
Always asking questions.
Exactly. And being comfortable with the idea that we might never have all the answers.
But the process itself is still valuable.
It is.
So it's more about being open to new discoveries and being flexible.
Being willing to adapt as we learn more.
I like that. So how does this apply to cultural resonance?
The report suggests that we should view each insight as a starting point for deeper exploration, not an endpoint.
So always digging deeper.
And this is where tools like AI can be really useful.
Because they can help us process information more quickly and efficiently.
Right. AI can help us sift through massive amounts of data,
To find those cultural signals.
the ones that we might miss otherwise.
But we still need that human element, right?
Absolutely. AI is a tool. It's not a replacement for human judgment.
So we still need researchers to interpret the data and make sense of it.
AI can help us see the patterns, but it's up to us to understand the meaning behind them and then figure out what to do with that information.
This all makes sense to me, but I'm still a little stuck on this idea of moving away from traditional metrics.
Yeah.
How do we know if we're successful? What are those new measures of success?
That's a great question. And it's not always a simple answer. The specific measures will likely vary depending on the situation.
The context.
Right. But I think there are some general principles we can think about, like alignment with values.
So are we creating things that align with our audience's values?
Exactly. Products, services, systems, everything, really. And cultural relevance.
Mm-hmm.
Are we tapping into those cultural trends and conversations that are shaping people's lives?
So it's not just about what we think is important, but what actually matters to our audience.
And then there's systemic impact. Are we contributing to a more sustainable and equitable world?
Those are some pretty big questions.
They are, but they're important ones to consider. And finally, adaptability and resilience
Are we creating organizations and systems that can handle change?
that are flexible and responsive.
That makes sense. So how can these new measures be integrated with existing research methods?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The report suggests that culture mapping can actually work hand in hand with other research methods to enhance their effectiveness and uncover even deeper insights.
So culture mapping isn't meant to replace those methods,
It's more about complementing them. For example, you have traditional need-state analysis.
which focuses on identifying people's needs.
Right, those functional needs. And by integrating culture mapping, we can add a layer of cultural understanding to those needs
To see the bigger picture.
and understand those underlying motivations and values.
Can you give us a specific example of how this might work in practice?
Let's say a company's developing a new line of sustainable clothing. They do some traditional market research and find out that consumers are interested in eco-friendly materials.
And ethical production practices.
But culture mapping can go a step further and explore those values and beliefs that are behind that interest.
Like what's driving that interest?
Exactly. Is it a sense of responsibility for the environment? Are they worried about social justice issues?
Interesting.
Do they identify with a specific subculture that values sustainability? These are questions that traditional research might miss.
So culture mapping helps connect those dots between what people say they want and why they want it.
And that deeper understanding can be really powerful, especially for product development and marketing.
This brings us back to the idea of ambiguous and evolving research domains. How can culture mapping help us navigate those more uncertain areas?
As the world is changing so quickly, traditional research methods often struggle to keep up.
Because they're based on more linear thinking?
Right, and predictable outcomes, which isn't always how things work in reality.
Things are rarely that straightforward.
Culture mapping, on the other hand, embraces that ambiguity and complexity. It recognizes that culture is always evolving and that there are often multiple ways to interpret the same thing.
So it's a more fluid approach.
Exactly, more adaptable. By using culture mapping, we can explore those emerging trends and cultural shifts that are often hard to capture through traditional methods.
So we can ask better questions.
More open-ended questions, and be open to unexpected discoveries.
Do you have an example of how culture mapping could be applied to a more ambiguous research area?
Sure. Let's take the future of work. It's a topic that's constantly changing, influenced by things like technology, globalization, and shifting social values.
And the pandemic certainly had a huge impact.
Traditional research might focus on measuring things like remote work adoption rates,
Or automation?
but culture mapping could dig deeper into the cultural narratives around work.
So what does work even mean to people in this post-pandemic world?
What are their values and aspirations? How are things like technology and globalization affecting their sense of identity and purpose? Those are questions that traditional research methods might not even address.
I see your point.
By using culture mapping, we can uncover those underlying anxieties, desires, aspirations.
The things that are actually driving people's behavior.
And then we can identify those emerging cultural narratives that are going to shape the future of work. And from there, we can develop strategies that actually meet people's needs, both individuals and organizations.
It sounds like culture mapping could be a really valuable tool for those areas where the future is still uncertain.
Exactly. It allows us to go beyond that linear thinking and embrace a more fluid approach to research.
This has been a really interesting discussion. It seems like we need to be willing to adapt our research methods as the world changes and be open to new ways of thinking.
I completely agree. The world is becoming more complex, more interconnected. And to thrive in this new environment, we need to be more nuanced in our thinking, more adaptable in our approaches. And I think culture mapping, with its focus on cultural understanding and its ability to handle ambiguity, offers a really powerful framework for navigating this new landscape.
So we talked about culture mapping's potential in those more uncertain areas, those
Right.
ambiguous and evolving research domains. But can you give us some concrete examples of how it's been used in the real world?
Definitely. One example that comes to mind is from the beauty industry.
A lot of cultural narratives around beauty.
Right. And brands are realizing that they need to move beyond those traditional demographics,
Age, gender, income,
those kinds of things, and actually connect with consumers on a deeper level.
more meaningful.
Culture mapping has been used to really understand those evolving narratives around beauty and identity.
So how do they do that?
By looking at things like social media conversations, online forums, cultural trends.
So it's about getting a sense of the broader conversation.
Exactly. And from that research, they can identify those values, beliefs, aspirations that are shaping how people feel about beauty products.
That's interesting. So how does that actually translate into strategies for beauty brands?
Well, for example, culture mapping has shown the increasing importance of inclusivity and diversity in beauty.
People are demanding more representation.
Exactly. Consumers are rejecting those narrow beauty standards of the past.
The ones that were very Eurocentric.
And they're embracing a much more expansive definition of beauty.
One that celebrates individual differences.
And this insight has actually led brands to expand their product offerings
To cater to a wider range of skin tones and hair types.
and to show more diverse models in their advertising.
So culture mapping is helping brands stay ahead of the curve.
By identifying those shifts in cultural expectations.
And not just reacting to trends, but actually shaping the cultural landscape.
I think that's key. Another great example is from the healthcare industry.
That's an area where cultural sensitivity is so important.
Absolutely. And culture mapping has been used to understand how cultural factors can influence health outcomes.
So how does that work?
Researchers have used it to explore those cultural beliefs and practices surrounding chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease.
Serious conditions.
And they found that in some cultures, there's a stigma around these conditions,
So people might not seek treatment.
or they might delay it. And in other cultures, traditional healing practices might be preferred over conventional medicine.
So understanding those nuances is really important.
It's critical because then healthcare providers can develop more effective communication strategies,
To reach those different patient populations.
tailor treatment plans to fit their specific needs, and create healthcare environments that are more culturally sensitive.
That makes a lot of sense. It seems like culture mapping isn't just about understanding consumer behavior
It has much broader implications.
for addressing important social issues.
I think so. It can help us bridge that gap between research and action.
Translate those insights into real solutions.
Exactly. So what does all of this mean for the future of research and innovation?
That's a big question.
It is. But I think culture mapping represents a pretty significant shift in how we think about research.
How so?
It moves us away from that traditional model of searching for definitive answers,
Where there's only one right answer,
and it encourages a more iterative and collaborative approach.
where we're constantly learning and evolving.
And that means embracing ambiguity, challenging our assumptions, being open to insights we might not expect.
That sounds like a much more dynamic approach.
It is, and it's more in line with how fast the world is changing. As we navigate an increasingly complex and interconnected world, those traditional research methods often fall short.
They can't keep up.
And culture mapping, with its focus on cultural understanding and its ability to navigate ambiguity, offers a really powerful tool for making sense of it all, especially in those areas where the future is still taking shape.
This deep dive into culture mapping has been fascinating. It's clear that cultural resonance isn't just some nice to have.
It's essential.
It needs to be baked into everything. Research, strategy, innovation.
Across all industries.
So as we wrap up, I'd like to encourage our listeners to really think about the potential of culture mapping, how it could transform their own fields, and to embrace this tool for navigating the complexities of the world we live in.
It's a powerful tool. I hope they do.